Hi, everyone. Nice to have you with us. I'm Kevin, the Climate and Environment Policy Analyst at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. And today we have our first webinar of our Policy Breakfast series, Breaking Down the Silos, Climate Mainstreaming and Holistic Policy Design in the face of multiple transitions. So today we're going to discuss our first policy brief of the series, Climate Justice Principles, a brief at the intersection between political philosophy and policy, where we explore and evaluate principles that can guide fair climate action from a global distributive justice perspective. So we're quite lucky to have with us the co-author, Dr. Carl Knight, Senior Lecturer in Political Theory at University of Glasgow. He's a political philosopher working on theories of distributive justice, like egalitarianism, prioritarianism, and sufficientarianism, and applied topics in distributive justice, so global justice, climate change, healthcare, and discrimination. We're also joined by two great discussants, Luc Bas, currently working for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, in the Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy. He has worked quite extensively on climate policy, including on FEPS's United for Climate Justice project, under the chairmanship of Teresa Ribera, Minister for Ecological Transition in Spain. So I also invite you to take a look at that. We also have Namita Kambli, a senior researcher at E3G, who is principally in support of a clean economy program there, and also complementing the work of the fossil transition programs on just transition. She's recently co-authored a brief on just decarbonization, an opportunity for EU-US cooperation, to participate in moving the topic of climate justice to the center of the policy debate, which is really essential. So it's part of a bigger project on breaking down the silos, where we try to make sure that we mainstream climate as a transversal issue in other policy fields. And today we're looking at the first brief of this series, which is a toolkit of principles that we can then use to produce fair outcomes in policy. And the goal is to move from theory to practice. So now I'll open the floor to Dr. Carl Knight for his presentation of the policy brief in question and outlining the most plausible account of climate justice from the fairness and moral philosophy perspective. So Carl, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thanks also to Louise and everyone else at FEPS who's helped to set up this wonderful event and the larger project that Kevin mentioned that it's part of. Okay, so hopefully you've all got my slides visible there. So I'll be talking to you about climate justice principles. This is going to basically cover the more philosophical part of the FEPS publication that is co-authored with Kevin, that came out a month or so ago, a couple of months now maybe. So I'll start off with an overview of some sort of broader issues that we'll be addressing. So political philosophy offers unique insights into the justice and injustice of alternative policy interventions. We're first going to be looking at some key concepts and questions that arise in this kind of setting. We'll then be surveying 6 leading principles of climate justice. We're going to raise some problems with an influential alternative to those, which is cost-benefit analysis. And finally, I'm going to very briefly state and defend 2 principles of climate justice, which are like egalitarianism and prioritarianism. Now, you won't know what those are just yet, we'll get onto them, and that will be explained. Okay, so firstly, there are 3 broad policy responses that can be considered, I suppose, to climate change. These will be, I think, familiar. So firstly, mitigation, which we can very briefly summarize as being a reduction in greenhouse gases, which can be achieved in various ways, but the main one is obviously to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases you're emitting in the first place. Second one is adaptation, which can be broadly construed as the reduction in the negative impact of climate change. So you're not actually, unlike the first option, which is actually reducing the radiative forcing effect, you're not reducing the radiative forcing effect for adaptation, but you're just adapting human societies to those heating effects. And then the third kind of policy response, which is kind of a slightly newer one, but that's come to the fore a bit in recent years, is compensation. So this is essentially a form of making amends for climate change loss and damage. Now, while nations are in practice the focus of international distribution, for instance, through the UNFCCC process, a fully just distribution would require that each individual bears a fair share. So this goes back to, I suppose, a methodological and ethical individualism that would be widely accepted in the climate justice literature. So, we talk about nations, but really the fundamental thing we're interested in is individuals, but nations are, important groupings of individuals essentially for policy purposes. Related to this is a distinction between practical principles of policy and the fundamental principles that might provide a theoretical or normative underpinning for those principles. And we're going to be looking at some of those principles in both categories as we go along. So we're now looking at some questions of climate justice. So the first question of climate justice is, who should bear the cost of climate change? Now, most principles of climate justice are concerned with this question, allocating the adaptation, compensation, and especially mitigation burdens of climate change. So the theories I'm going to be talking about, they cut across those three categories I mentioned. A second question of climate justice is how much mitigation is required. Obviously, this is a very important one. We want to reduce the amount of emissions. Now, that second one, as important as it is, political philosophers don't have as much to say about it. It's often seen as largely a kind of empirical or natural science kind of question, and we're just going to plug in the results from science into, our theories, our desired outcomes. So still, some principles will say something about that, and I think actually that's useful when they do that. Okay, I'm now starting in the survey of 6 principles. So we'll start off with polluter pays, which is fairly self-explanatory from the name. It says that those with high historical emissions should bear a large share of the cost of climate change. So there are some fairly obvious limitations, I think, with this principle. So firstly, it may seem unreasonable to hold countries liable for costs that or risks they were unaware of, which are typically, you could say pre-1990, you might choose a different date for the cutoff point, but in any case, clearly there was going to be some historical point before which we couldn't really say that countries knew that their emissions were causing climate change, whether it's 1990 or maybe the 80s or something. So that's one limitation. It might seem unfair to hold polluters accountable for pre-1990 emissions. And the second one, which maybe seems even stronger, is it may seem unfair to hold the current generation accountable for prior generations' emissions. So we could adjust the principle so it applies only to recent emissions. So we're saying, yeah, okay, we can't hold anyone accountable for emissions that were in the 19th century or something. We're just going to focus on more recent emissions. But that then seems to shift the burden decisively towards low and middle income countries. So for instance, if we were to look at 1990 onwards emissions, post-1990 emissions, China would have higher emissions, with that cut-off point than the US would have. So I think that undercuts some of the appeal of the polluter pays principle, because usually you would think the US would have a higher burden than China to address climate change, probably because it's richer. Furthermore, this shift intensifies as the developed world decarbonizes. So, in Europe, we have been fairly successful in mitigating, growth of emissions, whereas the developing world obviously is developing, so it is increasing its emissions. So if you actually adopt a polluter pays principle, which is often motivated by sort of trying to sort of make the West pay their fair share or something like that, that might look like a good idea right now, but over time that's going to get a worse and worse deal for the developing world, because many European countries have net zero targets. So they're eventually their emissions are not actually going to be very high. So there are some problems, I think, with this principle, even if it intuitively seems quite appealing. The second principle I want to mention is the beneficiary pays principle. So this principle says that states should bear the cost of climate change in proportion to the benefits they've derived from greenhouse gas emitting activity. So the underlying idea is that you shouldn't profit from harm to others, even if you're blameless. So this removes those limitations we saw with polluter pays, because we're not saying, for instance, that current young people are responsible for pre-1990 emissions. We're just saying that they've benefited from them because their society has benefited from those emissions in various ways. But there is one significant problem with this principle of beneficiary pays, which is the disaggregation problem. It seems impossible to distinguish between benefits that are derived from climate change inducing action and those that aren't. It seems like we're almost saying everything is kind of derived in some way from climate change emitting activity, because we haven't had net zero societies or anything like that. So one solution, which is quite simple, is to treat all wealth as essentially derived from climate change. And then we seem to have a principle that's sort of actually saying, not really focused on pollution per se. It's more or less saying that the richer you are, the more you pay. And that's a different principle. That's the ability to pay principle, which we'll come on to shortly. So we'll now mention a third principle, which is the principle of grandfathering. And this is, like the other two principles we mentioned so far, a historical principle. But it is quite different. It maintains that those with high historical emissions thereby gain entitlements to high future emissions. Okay, so the general idea is that agents can continue practices they wouldn't now be allowed to initiate. That's quite intuitive. It's used in all kinds of contexts. For instance, you know, older cars have lower standards than new ones do. Now, political philosophers have largely dismissed grandfathering as obviously unjust, but I'd say it's hard to argue, for instance, that Czechia should immediately reduce its emissions to those of Hungary. You know, it would be devastating for the economy to have to do something like that. So it seems there must be a place for this principle, at least as a moderate and transitional principle. Fourth principle I'm going to mention is the guaranteed minimum. So this requires that everyone worldwide is guaranteed enough for a decent life. And it draws on the distinction between subsistence emissions, which everyone has an entitlement to, and luxury emissions, which seems very intuitive. This is accepted by political philosophers, but it's very limited in scope. We may think that people have entitlements to emit more than just you know, the bare minimum for a decent life, especially where many have much more than that. So the fifth principle I want to mention is emissions egalitarianism, and this proposes that everyone worldwide has an identical entitlement to the use of the atmosphere's absorptive capacity. It accordingly says that emission entitlements should be distributed equally on an individual basis. After all, why should Americans have more than Brazilians? It's an example from Jameson. But a simple version of this view seems to encourage pronatalism, because if you basically, a country can increase its population and thereby get more emissions entitlements, it seems to have this sort of perverse incentive of incentivizing countries to increase the population. And obviously that's very much at odds with climate change mitigation. If population is indexed to a base year, which would solve that perverse incentive problem, it would then be the case that Americans are getting more after all than Brazilians, because Brazil has a higher population growth. So you might also say this principle lacks a theoretical basis. So philosophical theories of equality, for instance, distribute goods as a whole rather than one particular good for emissions. So it's an initially appealing principle, but I think there are actually problems with it. And the final principle of these six, we're going to mention a couple more after this, is the principle of ability to pay, which I did mention in passing earlier. And this distributes the burdens of climate change in proportion to the agent's ability to pay, i.e. the rich pay more. So it's concerned with absolute levels of advantage, like the guaranteed minimum principle, but it's more ambitious. So it's not saying we get everyone to a decent level. It just says, you know, says the richer you are, the more you pay, basically, and the poorer you are, the less you pay. Yeah, it too may seem to encourage pronatalism, because if you increase the size of your population, then you know you're making your country poorer, all else equal. So that's going to trigger reduced climate burdens. That also seems to be potentially a problem with this principle. I'm very briefly going to mention cost-benefit analysis, which is a kind of standard, very influential alternative to these climate justice principles, which is popular in economics, especially, which is basically maximizing welfare. It's a kind of applied version of utilitarianism. There seem three main problems here. So firstly, it generally, the kind of welfare used generally reflects market value. So the rich's interests are going to be given excess weight compared to the poor's interests. It uses usually an unacceptably high pure time discount rate. So benefits for future people count for a lot less than benefits of current people. And utilitarianism is also insensitive to distributive justice. So it's giving no priority to the worse off, which we might think is appropriate to give priority to the worse off. And it also gives no priority to those that make better climate choices. So climate sinners will do just as well as climate saints under that principle, and that might not seem fair. So I'm therefore going to defend two principles that address some of the shortfalls of those earlier principles we mentioned, which are often used in discussions. They're kind of slightly more practical principles. These are kind of fundamental principles that I think underpin some of those principles, but actually pull out the normative core of their ideas. The first fundamental principle, prioritarianism, says that all welfare counts, as utilitarianism does, but it says that welfare for the worse off counts for more. So a simple version of this view, we don't really need to go through this bit, but it basically says that you sum the square roots of individuals. Don't worry if you don't quite get that. The next slide will make that a bit clearer. So prioritarianism is similar to the ability to pay principle, but it improves on it by firstly considering the overall amount of well-being, removing perverse incentives, and secondly addresses the how much mitigation question as well as the who should bear the costs question. Because prioritarianism is saying that we increase welfare and also give priority to the worst off, it's going to apply both to the question of how much mitigation and the question of who's paying the cost of that, whereas ability to pay is just a question about who bears the cost. Okay, so here's just a very quick illustration of some of square root prioritarianism. So you look at the dashed line, that's utilitarianism. So it just says, 1 unit of welfare has 1 unit of value. So it weighs benefits for the worse off and the better off equally. Whereas prioritarianism, which is the curved solid line, because it does a transformation. So the function, in this case, the square root transformation, it's not the case that 1 extra unit is always 1 extra unit. 1 extra unit of welfare is always 1 extra unit of value. We get this nice curve, which means we're giving priority to the worse off, because if you're worse off, then a unit for you is going to count for more than the unit for a better off person. Okay, so the second fundamental principle that I'll mention, and this will be the conclusion as well, is Luck egalitarianism. And this says that those who have made more praiseworthy, for instance, lower emitting choices, are going to be due more. So the basic idea is that inequality is permissible only where it responds to differential exercises of individual responsibility rather than being the result of individual luck. So the name luck egalitarianism is the idea that you're equalizing luck. So the effects of luck on people's lives are removed, but we make people accountable for the things that are not matters of luck for them, but matters of choice for them. So we propose to combine prioritarianism with luck egalitarianism, and that overall view is called luck prioritarianism. So it says a distribution gets better the more welfare it contains, the more welfare there is for the worse off, and the more welfare goes to those who have made good choices. Okay, that's it from me for now. I will be responding to the discussants at the moment.
Thanks, Carl, and for presenting these principles. Hopefully we can now test this account of climate justice by discussing it a little bit further with Luc and Namita in relation to their own work. But one of the key findings of the policy brief is really that we need to make sure that the practical principles in policymaking also align with the fundamental moral principles so that we can really strive towards the same goal of making sure that the worst off are sheltered from harm, and that we increase the well-being on a global level and also take into account the global picture. Just a reminder to our participants online that if you have any questions so far in the audience, don't forget to post them, and also make sure to tell us which speaker or discussant you'd like to address the question to, and we'll answer all the questions at the end. I'll now open the floor to Luc, who's going to give some initial thoughts about the principles and how they might be relevant to other work he's currently conducting, so we can really suss out the barriers that exist in translating climate justice from political philosophy into policy practice.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for that incredible presentation, Carl. And for me, it's an eye-opener because I love philosophy, but I'm obviously not a philosopher and not as knowledgeable on it. But it's really refreshing to see it from a rather theoretical point of view. But it triggers quite a few, obviously, questions and comments. And I don't want to comment too much on the presentation itself. I'll just go through a few things. There's just one thing I wanted to say, which is quite interesting, is the polluter pays principle as you used in the beginning, where you then refer to, okay, how do we account for those that didn't know that they were actually causing climate change? And that is a tricky one, especially when we mentioned 1990, which is the golden year as a reference, but it was known way before. It's like with asbestos. Those that are guilty to have produced asbestos in the time, it was clear that it was harmful, and so they're paying. And I think it's similar here in this case. Just as an example, yes, I should maybe clarify. I'm the vice chair for the CESP, the Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy at the IUCN. That's a voluntary role, I should say. I'm between jobs at the moment, but I do represent the IUCN in this commission in Europe. And it is a commission that focuses on the economic and social impacts or effects or contexts for environmental policy. And with that, I wanted to say that the biggest silo we are creating at the moment is, in fact, the climate silo itself. We're starting to look in, and we're talking about breaking the silos, and I wanted to just emphasize that this basically is all about resources. Huh? We have to look at how we manage resources. And if you go back to the historic guild, then that's easier to point at, because there is no doubt that there is an incredible historical depth from the richer countries on how they have been resourcing cheap resources and have built wealth on it. And one of the effects was CO2 emissions and climate change. But it's much more than that. And so we have to look at this in a much broader perspective, which of course the SDGs do. I think overall, when you kind of sum this all up, the environmental climate, the sustainability challenge is basically a redistribution challenge. So we have to reduce our consumption, the emissions, and therefore consumption drastically in those parts of the world that have been emitting and have been using resources at big scale. We have to stay within the planetary boundaries, and that's clear. Those are quite clear. But if you look at this redistribution, what's less clear is, and it's also mentioned in the paper, is what is this minimum material wealth that everybody should be entitled to? And even if you go to a very basic entitlement, which is basic energy, even that needs to be defined, basic housing, and then of course all the social security context and education, but that's not necessarily having a weight on the resources. Even if we would do that, if you then have to start looking at everybody's fair share, the reduction of consumption in OECD countries is massive. Now here we come to all the theories and principles, but I think that is the big elephant in the room. And we have to dare to bring it up, because what we also know, what is politically feasible at the moment is ecologically irrelevant. That's another really important point to make. And at the same time, it also has to happen, all has to happen in a socially just way. Maybe it's interesting for this group here and the people that are on this webinar to remind and also to see how this new project with breaking the silos and these climate principles, climate justice principles, link up with what was done earlier by the steering committee. Won't be too long on it, but there was a clear view on just transition plans, which is basically a redistribution approach, and then looking at some of the tools, which is finance and investment and trade, and where you have the taxation mechanism that is the most important. And here is another uncomfortable elephant in the room. It's taxing the wealthy, it's taxing the rich. We don't have to beat around the bush. It's just what it is, and that becomes very political immediately. And if you're not careful, you immediately end up in either being pointed as a socialist, and even worse as a communist, if we talk about this. But I think it's an honest reflection. We need to use the tools that we have today also to make that happen faster. And then maybe one important thing that was mentioned as well is the intergenerational solidarity, and having the young people really engage and participate in decision making. Is not just being kind of heard in a council, but really being part of the decision making. I think this is a third principle that was discussed back then. And then of course, and this is something that's at the heart of the CISP, of this commission of ICN, is a rights-based approach. So just to focus again on how this is a right to a healthy environment. I think that's important to remind in the context of principles. And then finally, and I think here I'll try to close, is that much of the solution is in mitigation and adaptation, and where you have as I can say, a double whammy is in how nature is involved in it, the nature-based solutions and how they're being implemented. But that is even getting closer to the heart of local communities, indigenous peoples, and how they control their own lands, for example, and how that solution then also can have adverse effects if we don't make sure that we do it in the right way with the right approaches. So finally, I think it's a lot of governance that we need to dare to point at, that it is a redistributional approach that is needed. And maybe to end on a positive note, and with the latest vote in Parliament very recently, and it might be a bit of a bridge to Namita later, is the Social Climate Fund is one of these hope-giving elements within the EU. But I think even within the EU, but even more importantly, in its external relations, this has to be much more than the even 86 billion that is now foreseen in this climate fund. And that's of course scary numbers, but then again, if you look at other parts of the economy, those numbers are not so incredible. And maybe a final point is the lead into next year when we will have the European elections. If we want a Green Deal, which is part of this debate and part of the work of the EU in this context, it has to be even stronger on its social elements and on social components, because we will otherwise not get the population on our side to get a Green Deal that is needed, which actually has to be more ambitious than we have in front of us, which is already a great piece of work and is hope-giving and looking at 2030 in a very positive way. But 2040 is around the corner, and let alone 2050 at a net zero context. And to do that in a fair way, this element of a social just approach will be crucial. So I'll leave it here.
Thanks so much for your intervention, Luc. I think a lot of good points, especially on the scope of the crisis that we're facing, which is not limited to the carbon tunnel that we often might have, but also to biodiversity loss and the distribution of resources. So thank you for including that into the debate. At FEPS, we're also hoping to work a little bit on the trade-offs that we need to make between the scale-up of renewables and biodiversity loss. So keep an eye out for that. And on quantifying the minimum rights and exactly what we need to consider a baseline level of well-being. We're also hoping to work on basic energy minimum rights. So also keep an eye out for that. And the last point from my side on the just transition plans, there might also be some resources upcoming that I will share with all of you on this topic. I'm now going to pass the floor to Namita, who is also doing a significant work on integrating climate justice into policy debates. So Namita, when you hear Luc's intervention and you first hear these principles, what are the questions that emerge for you? How do you cross this over with your own experience in the field?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, thanks, Carl and Luc. I just wanted to say that before I actually go there, I'm really excited to be here. I spend unhealthy amounts of time thinking about how social justice and climate justice intersects. And I especially want to thank Carl for teaching me about luck prioritarianism. I think I will use that the next time I want to sound smart in an intimidating setting. Yeah, so my name is Namita. I work as a research manager at E3G on Just Transition. And E3G is a climate change think tank whose mission is to sort of advance a climate safe world for all. And it is actually the for all part, which is where I come in. All of the policy research and advocacy that I do is based around sort of the intersection of climate change and inequality. But the point of this is trying to understand how climate action can be treated as a fairness issue, essentially. And today's, I think this webinar and the principles that you talked about, Carl, as well as the points you raised, Luc, I think for me, and you mentioned this as well, Luc, this is especially timely because yesterday, one of the core fairness authors of the Fit for 55 package, the Social Climate Fund, was officially adopted in the European Parliament. And I have spent the past 22 months, more or less, following this policy instrument. And I see that there are several people on the call who have as well, and which is why I sort of wanted to base my intervention sort of drawing parallels between what I've learned and the points that sort of Carl has raised, which is also, Kevin, I hope, one way to answer the question you posed. And there are 3 points in particular that I want to touch upon, starting with just very, setting the scene in terms of where the climate justice debate is at in the EU. This idea of giving priority to the worst off when it comes to climate action. And lastly, what this focus on vulnerability and inequality means and why it's relevant for EU policymaking going forward. And you will have noticed that I've said EU at least 5 times by now, which is an indication of the fact that this is the level that I work on and will focus on. But rest assured that these points that I'm about to raise on decarbonization or on just decarbonization or justice or fairness are applicable for decarbonization legislation across the board, and including in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. But okay, to begin with, we do not really talk about climate justice in the EU bubble as much as we do about, say, a just transition. But to be fair, I have to say that the just transition debate has itself come a long way since the Fit for 55 package was sort of first proposed in July of 2021. And the discourse is still very much framed, is still one of leaving no one behind, but we are increasingly hearing references to social fairness, and even the term climate justice is slowly becoming part of the EU's vocabulary, to not just talk about international, global climate justice, but even within the EU. The main issue, though, is that all of these terms, climate justice, just transition, fairness, they're fairly open to interpretation, which means that there is no common or shared understanding of what fairness means or what the just in the just transition stands for, which in turn affects how we sort of fold it into policymaking, how we mainstream it. And here I'd like to just take the example of the Social Climate Fund, which Luc also mentioned. Now, the main purpose of this fund is to shield vulnerable households and micro enterprises from negative impacts of carbon pricing. And the way it does this is by providing temporary direct income support and financial support to invest in clean alternatives. Now, there is a clear acknowledgement here that vulnerable groups face particular barriers to investing in structural measures. And without this specific prioritization, these groups will become locked into, say, fossil fuel use and accordingly sort of like exposure to carbon pricing for longer. Despite this positive of, prioritization, and the Social Climate Fund, to me, remains essentially a compensation measure, which also kind of like exemplifies, well, rather it illustrates the EU's current approach to fairness, which is to remedy what is essentially a political challenge with a financial instrument. And think of it as a loose form of retroactive justice, if you will. And this is not to say at all that this question of redistribution of who should bear the cost of climate action here, I say, is not a crucial one. Very much so. But what I've seen in my work is that while we often ask who pays or who benefits, we very rarely ask who decides, who gets to have a say in, and rather how is their participation enabled. And actually, think of it as when Carl talked about fair share of the benefits, I'm extending it to say a fair say as well. And the reason I say this is because if we think of climate justice as a subset of social justice, involving people in the decisions that affect their future well-being is very much a matter of social justice. And this will be applicable to the Social Climate Fund as well, because member states will need to draw up what are called social climate plans to unlock funding. And here we will need to pay close attention to who is at the table, whose voice has been considered as legitimate, because to me, this will also broaden our understanding of vulnerability and marginalization. Now, Luc, of course, mentioned young people and intergenerational justice, but there are also aspects of gender, of race, of ability, of resident status, to name just a few. And the hope is that this will make policy making more effective, but also way more inclusive. So the point I'm trying to say is that recognition justice, in a way, is just as important as redistributive justice. But this is an aspect that is still seen as a nice to have, but not as a central tenet of justice. And before you think that this is a moral or ethical imperative, let me assure you that it's not, because there are legal frameworks such as the Aarhus Convention, the governance regulation in the EU, or even the European Code of Conduct for Partnerships, which sort of requires meaningful participation to be carried out. And I just want to sort of highlight here that the institutional record on this has been very poor, be it with respect to the recovery and resilience plans or the national energy and climate plans. And the Social Climate Fund simply cannot afford to make the same mistakes if it is to really shelter those hard done by and protect them from harm. And here again, it won't be enough to just consider them in these plans, but we need to ensure that their voice, that their interests, and their lived experience are sort of reflected in policymaking, and that the channels and the mechanisms are in place to enable this. And I will stop here, but the point that I would like to leave you with is the implications for policymaking. Now, giving equal weights to recognition and redistribution in policymaking will ensure that past injustices are not repeated or replaced, and the approach to sort of fairness and just policymaking shifts from beyond compensation to giving people more agency over their lives. And like Luc said, this is important because the elections are coming up next year, and the goal should not be to just prevent social backlash, but to actually build a long-term public mandate for climate action, which is the only way to really accelerate and sustain it. And I'll stop here. Thank you
so much, Namita. And I completely agree that recognition justice is an essential element of the climate justice debate. Our brief was not long enough to cover it, but I also hope to see more citizen empowerment rather than simply the management of social movements, because we need, in the face of this challenge, to all be together working at it if we want a realistic chance of succeeding in avoiding the worst consequences of climate change. Perhaps we can have some very brief reactions, 1 minute, 30 seconds each, from Carl and Luc on Namita's intervention. Carl, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Namita, and Kevin, of course. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree on the importance to have kind of recognition justice as well as distributive justice. You know, the need for kind of fair decision-making processes and you know, citizen agency and things like that. I mean, but there is also, of course, an important connection between them. I think if everyone's interests are fully represented and effectively communicated in a way, they're going to be more fully accommodated probably in the policies that result from that. So in a sense, you're more likely to get a just distributive outcome if you have sort of just procedural or sort of recognition in place. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that. You know, I don't think I have anything more to say on it than you do, and yeah, but I certainly agree on that.
Thanks, Carl. To Luc now, if you have a reaction to this.
Yeah, sure, of course. It's interesting that I think we're starting to talk about climate democracy, because and apparently, I mean, I think our democracies are, at least in some parts of the world, quite well organized, but it's of course impossible to have it perfect. There will always be some way to make it representative, because otherwise you get totally lost. So it's about rethinking, and this is where the whole sustainable development governance question comes in, and climate is the one that is now giving the most fuel to it. Well, nice expression maybe to say giving fuel, but but I think it's where the acceleration comes from, which is good. But I think it's again a larger part of the sustainability debate. And it's interesting how, when I've been involved in sustainable development discussions 25 years now, and so we've drifted away from sustainable development partners SDGs, but to transitions, and we say sustainability transitions, because somehow sustainable development has become this kind of too bigger concept, has been corrupted. But I think we should go back to the basics of this, and sustainable development, which has a very strong governance element to it, and which is all of what Namita just said, that is needed to advance the agenda on climate, but also on the larger environment agenda, which is then basically a social agenda. But yeah, climate democracy, maybe that's a new term to think of.
Thanks, Luc. Inspirational terminology that we can bring forward after this webinar. So now I'd like to open the floor in the spirit of citizen empowerment to the question of Pedro, which I'll read out just now. So we have a first question for Dr. Carl Knight, and he's saying, I'm wondering how exactly you conjugate Locke egalitarianism with neocolonialism, meaning, did, for example, Uganda emit more than the US out of doing virtuous practice, or because it simply couldn't emit more due to the resource drain the global north does on the global south? So this first question to Carl, if we can keep it brief as well, and then we'll go to Luc's question.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, surely the US emits a lot more than Uganda. Maybe that's the wrong way around.
He's asking how you factor in neo-colonialism into your Locke egalitarian approach, if that's something that you'd like to pick up on.
I mean, I suppose what I would say in that sort of space, it is that in a kind of neo-colonial distributive pattern, which is essentially what we kind of have. You know, resources are heavily concentrated in the global north. So you know that's unjust. You know, that's unjust under a Locke egalitarian scheme or under a prioritarian scheme. So it's unjust when you combine those things. You know, if you think about the average Ugandan, you know, their emissions are a lot, I assume, are a lot lower than the average Americans, and you know, they're no less deserving or anything. So you know, that's an injustice on a Locke egalitarian scheme. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the account I give doesn't treat, let's say, colonialism as it doesn't really distinguish it from other processes by which you might have different unjust outcomes. You know, for instance, there would be unjust processes within a society that you might not refer to as colonial. You know, there might be, for instance, class injustices that might not be referred to as colonial, but they would be identified as unjust. So it would be a similar, you know, I would say that there's something of a parallel in those kinds of cases. You know, because like egalitarianism and prioritarianism have this ambition to be a fundamental principle, they're aiming to identify something that's unjust in all those different kinds of contexts, which is not to say that those contexts are not important. Of course, colonialism or neo-colonialism is among the most important causes of climate injustice and injustice more generally, I would say.
Thanks for the clarifications, Carl. Now I'll read the question to Luc Bas. So Pedro is also asking, do you therefore find it is a communication problem to address the real solutions to climate change, given decades of anti-communist propaganda? And he says, I have been noticing how for the past years, scholars have been successfully, I believe, rebranding socialism and communism as post-growth and degrowth, not as an overarching term, but in opposition to capitalism as requiring infinite growth. So quite interesting when considering the ideological ramifications of a resource debate. Luc, in 30 seconds, it would be great if you could address some of that big.
Yes, first of all, I would be interested to know who Pedro Mendes is, because he's been asking the two questions, and it would be nice for us to know who he's with or what his background is. But by the way, two really good questions. Yes, I think the anti-communist propaganda is an interesting point. I don't want to go into it, but we all know that communism, unfortunately, in the form it had been executed, unfortunately, miserably failed. We have to admit that. So it's when you attach a redistributional debate to communism, it's potentially not helpful. And therefore that rebranding, I think, that is being talked about is important. Then again, if you talk about degrowth or post-growth, I mean, it's all about what kind of growth, of course. I think there is still room to grow, but not in material output or in material use or in consumption. That's where it doesn't work anymore. Or it has to be on an even par with some parts of the world that still have their fair share of growth entitled, which then means that some will have to really slow down or even stop growing, which is becoming immediately uncomfortable. But it's just a truth. It's a reality. And maybe in the last 10 seconds, if you look at Kate Raworth's donut economy, it's an interesting concept. It's one that gets attention. The only thing is not answered in that donut, really, and I've had good discussions with her, is what is that inner circle when it comes to the material wealth? That is the social wealth, education, and so on and so forth, social security and illness security. But we just don't come to the point to define what has to be redistributed. The planetary boundaries are known, but we don't know what that, or we don't dare to say what it really means on consumption, on a fair part of consumption. And these concepts of growth or degrowth, then at that moment are maybe not as relevant.
Thanks, Luc. If it's acceptable to go 5 minutes over time, we'll give one last question to Namita. So we have Anna, who is asking how you see recognitional justice applied in practice to policymaking processes, especially in terms of including groups that are at risk affected, but somewhat outside the policymaking bubble. For example, indigenous peoples or non-EU populations affected by EU policies. Here again, let's keep it very short so we don't go more than 5 minutes over time. Thanks.
Okay, a 30-second answer, Anna. Very poorly, I would say, but I think there is scope to sort of fold this in. So with the new Critical Raw Minerals Act, for example, or the new legislation on due diligence, I think these are avenues to sort of bring in the human rights lens and including and create sort of like adherence to frameworks such as the human rights framework, but also other frameworks that include sort of the involvement of indigenous groups. I am trying to find the exact, because I know that the ILO, for example, has such legal guidance as well and strategic frameworks, but I will find the exact name of it and post it in the chat in a second. But thank you for asking. The short answer is not very well, and the EU definitely needs to do better.
Thanks, Namita. So now I will conclude the meeting, and thank you all for joining. Very rich discussion today. So some key terms to leave with: recognition justice, distributive justice, climate democracy, resource use. And thank you also to the team that helped set this up, Luis and Rodrigo. And if you've enjoyed the interaction today, please make sure to come also to our climate mainstreaming into health policy, which is happening on 27th of April. And the next ones will be on mainstreaming climate into digital and mainstreaming climate into gender policy. So we'll build a little bit on the discussions we started here today. Thank you all.
Thanks. Thanks for a good exchange. Nice to meet you.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.